The voicemail saved my life. And the man my daughter married 3 years ago had been trying to take everything I had left. I didn't know any of that when I pulled into my driveway that Tuesday afternoon. I just knew I was tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones after you've spent 2 hours sitting beside a grave, talking to someone who can't talk back. My wife's name was Lorraine. We were married for 38 years. She passed in October, and by March I still hadn't figured out how to come home to a quiet house, without it feeling like a small kind of drowning. So I drove. Some days I'd go out to the cemetery off Route 9, the one with the old oak trees that she always liked, and I'd sit there in the folding chair I kept in my trunk, and I'd just tell her things. What the weather was doing, what I'd had for breakfast, whether the Cardinals were going to have a decent season. That Tuesday, I'd told her I was worried. I hadn't told anyone else. That's the thing about grief. You end up saying your truest things to the people who can't respond. I was 64 years old. I'd worked 31 years as a structural engineer for the city of St. Louis. My hands still knew how to read a blueprint. My mind was sharp. I knew who I was. But something had been feeling wrong for about 6 weeks, and I couldn't name it, and so I'd driven out to tell Lorraine about it instead. My next-door neighbor was standing in his driveway when I pulled in. His name is Russell. He's 71, retired school teacher, the kind of man who notices everything and says very little. He and his wife moved in next door about 12 years ago. Lorraine used to bring them tomatoes from her garden. After she passed, he started leaving firewood on my porch without being asked. He was standing there with his arms crossed, which wasn't like him. Russell is a relaxed man, unhurried. The arms crossed thing made me slow down before I'd even opened my car door. I rolled down the window. "Everything okay?" He walked over. Not fast, but with a kind of deliberateness that made something tighten in my chest. "I need you to hear something before you go in," he said. I looked at my house. Front door was closed. Nothing obviously wrong. "What's going on?" "I've been sitting on this for 2 days," he said, "because I wasn't sure it was my place. But I watched you drive away this morning and I can't not tell you." He held out his phone. I looked at the screen. It was a voice memo. The timestamp said it was recorded 49 hours ago. "My kitchen window was open," he said. "Your daughter-in-law was in your backyard. I could hear her through the fence. She didn't know anyone was listening." I want to be precise about what happened in my body when he said that. My chest didn't tighten further. My breathing didn't change. What happened was subtler than that, and worse. It was the feeling of something slotting into place. A shape I'd been sensing in the dark for weeks, finally made visible. I pressed play. Her voice was clear. "My son's wife. I'll call her my daughter-in-law because that's what she is. Whatever else she may be. She was talking to someone on her phone. And what she said, standing in my backyard on a Sunday morning while I was at church, was this: 'The conservatorship paperwork is almost ready. My cousin says if we can get 2 doctors to sign off, we can have it filed within 60 days. Once that's done, the house goes into the estate account and we control the disbursements.'" A pause. The other person was talking. "He won't fight it," she said. "He's been depressed since Lorraine died. That's documented. The grief counselor he saw in November, that's already in the file. We're framing it as a welfare concern. Nobody questions a grieving widower who seems confused." Another pause. "The son is on board. He just needs to stop second-guessing himself." I stopped the recording. I sat in my car for a long moment. Russell didn't say anything. He just stood there, the way good men do when there's nothing useful to say. My son. My only child. 36 years old. His mother had loved him with a fierceness that sometimes startled even me. She'd driven 4 hours to bring him soup when he had his appendix out at 28. She'd cried at his wedding like it was both the best and most terrifying thing she'd ever witnessed. And now, apparently, he was on board. I pressed play again and listened to the whole thing. 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Then I handed the phone back to Russell. "How much of this did you hear in real time?" I asked. "All of it," he said. I hit record about 10 seconds in, when I realized what she was saying. I nodded. "I'm sorry," Russell said. "Don't be," I said. "You just gave me something I needed." I went inside. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table that Lorraine had picked out at an estate sale in 2009, the one with the slightly uneven legs she always said she was going to fix but never did, and I thought about the past 6 weeks. It started making sense in a different way now. The visit in late January. My daughter-in-law driving down from Chicago, which she almost never did, arriving on a Wednesday without my son, which had never happened before. She'd been warm, almost performatively warm. She'd cooked dinner, cleaned up afterward, asked a lot of questions about the house. How old was the roof? Did I have a financial advisor? What was the mortgage situation? I'd thought she was being considerate. Lorraine had just been gone for 3 months. I thought maybe she was trying. Then the visit to the doctor she'd scheduled for me in February. She'd found a physician in my insurance network, she said, and booked me an appointment for what she called a routine wellness check. I'd gone because it seemed reasonable. The doctor had asked me a lot of questions, memory questions, pattern questions. I'd answered them fine. But I remembered now that my daughter-in-law had asked to speak to the doctor privately for a few minutes before I came in. I'd waited in the lobby and not thought much of it. The grief counselor from November, she'd encouraged me to go, said it would be good for me. I had gone twice, and the counselor was perfectly decent, but I'd stopped going because it didn't useful. I hadn't told my daughter-in-law I'd stopped going. I wondered now what had been written in that file she mentioned, and my son. The calls over the past month. He'd been strange on the phone, distracted, a little guilty sounding, asking questions about my finances in ways that didn't quite feel like curiosity. I'd attributed it to stress. He and his wife had been having a difficult year, or so I'd assumed. I sat there at that uneven kitchen table and I thought, I am 64 years old. I am not confused. I am not impaired. I am grieving, which is a different thing, and someone has decided to use that grief as a legal weapon. I called my attorney at 4:15 that afternoon. Her name is Inez. I'd used her for the estate planning after Lorraine's diagnosis, and she's one of those attorneys who picks up the phone herself, which I have always considered a mark of character. I told her what I'd heard. I told her about the conservatorship paperwork, the 2 doctors, the 60-day timeline. I read her the exact words I'd written down. There was a silence on her end. "Are you somewhere safe right now?" she asked. "I'm in my house." "Okay, I need you to listen to me. Do not confront your daughter-in-law. Do not confront your son. Do not change your behavior in any way that signals you know about this." "Can you do that?" I said I could. "I'm going to make some calls tomorrow morning," she said. "First thing. In the meantime, I want you to think about whether your son has access to any of your financial accounts." He did. I'd added him to my checking account after Lorraine's diagnosis, for practical reasons, so he could help manage things if I needed it. I told Inez this, another silence. Longer. "Tomorrow morning," she said again. First thing. After I hung up, I sat for a while longer. The house was quiet in the way it always was now. Not peaceful, just absent. Lorraine had been a person who filled a room without trying. Her reading glasses on the side table, her shows on in the background, her voice calling from the kitchen to ask if I wanted anything. I looked at the uneven leg of the table. I thought she would have known what to do. Then I thought, no, she would have known what to feel. The doing, she always said, was my department. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. I did not sleep. That was fine. The next morning I drove to Inez's office at 9 a.m. She had already made 4 calls by the time I arrived. She sat across from me with a yellow legal pad and explained things in the precise, unhurried way I had always appreciated about her. The conservatorship process, she said, was real, and it was possible, and my daughter-in-law was not wrong that it could be initiated. In Missouri, a person can petition for guardianship or conservatorship over another adult if they can demonstrate that the person is unable to manage their own affairs due to a mental or physical condition. It requires a court proceeding. It requires medical evidence. It is not something that happens quietly. But here was the thing. The petition could be filed without my knowledge, and if it moved quickly, I might be in a reactive position legally before I'd even had a chance to respond. She said 60 days, I told Inez. Inez nodded. She'd heard me. Then we have work to do. She walked me through it. We would establish, in documented form, my current mental and physical status, a full evaluation from my own physician, which she would arrange. We would review my financial accounts and document their current state. We would consult with a litigation attorney in case this moved to court. And most importantly, we would have an independent review of any documentation already submitted about my mental capacity. The grief counselor, I said. Yes, we need to know what's in those notes. I authorized the release of my medical records that morning. I also authorized Inez to speak to the doctor I'd seen in February. And then I asked the question I'd been holding since the night before. My son, I said. What happens to him? Inez set her pen down. That depends on what he actually knew and when. There's a meaningful legal difference between someone who was manipulated into participating and someone who was an active architect of fraud. He's not a bad person, I said. And even as I said it, I wasn't entirely sure I believed it. But I believed it enough to say it. That may be, Inez said. But right now, until we know more, you treat him the way you treat his wife, normally, without signaling that anything has changed. I drove home. I stopped at the grocery store and bought things I didn't need because I wanted to feel like a person who was doing ordinary things. I bought coffee and a bag of those clementines Lorraine used to eat by the dozens in winter. I put them in the bowl on the counter where she used to keep them. That evening my daughter-in-law called. I answered on the second ring. I was pleasant. I told her I'd had a quiet day. I asked about my son. She said he'd been busy with work, which she said with a very slight edge. The kind that married people sometimes use to signal that all was not entirely well between them without actually saying so. I asked when they were planning to visit next. She said they'd talked about coming down in a few weeks. I said that would be wonderful. After I hung up, I sat very still for a moment. Then I got up and went outside and walked around the block. The air was cold, and the street lights were doing that thing they do in early spring, where the light seems yellow and tentative, like it's not entirely sure yet. I walked 2 blocks down to the park where Lorraine used to walk the dog we'd had years ago, and I sat on a bench, and I allowed myself 5 minutes of the feeling that had been pressing against the back of my ribs since the afternoon before. Betrayal is a strange thing. It doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in layers, and each layer is slightly different. First the sharp thing, the factual shock of it, and then something quieter and sadder, and then something that's almost like grief, because in some ways it is grief. You lose the version of the person you thought you knew. My son had called me Dad for 36 years. He'd learned to ride a bike in our driveway. He'd broken his arm falling out of the tree in our backyard when he was 9 and cried into my shoulder in the hospital, and I had held him and told him it was going to be okay, and it had been. He'd stood at the altar and cried when his mother walked him up the aisle and took his hands and said something I wasn't close enough to hear, and I had watched from the front row and thought, we did something right. How do you hold both things? I don't know. I sat on that bench for longer than 5 minutes, and I didn't come to any conclusions. I just sat. What Inez found over the next 3 weeks was worse than I'd expected and less bad than I'd feared. My medical file from the February appointment had been annotated with a summary note suggesting I had demonstrated difficulty with sequential memory tasks and showed signs of complicated grief affecting daily functioning. The grief counselor's notes from November, 2 sessions I'd attended and then discontinued, had been subpoenaed in a preliminary court inquiry I hadn't been notified about because the petition hadn't been formally filed yet, just initiated. My daughter-in-law's cousin, it turned out, was a paralegal in an elder law firm in Chicago. She had not, however, involved a second doctor. Inez told me that was where the 60-day plan had run into complications. Finding 2 physicians willing to sign off on a capacity evaluation without the subject's full cooperation was harder than my daughter-in-law's cousin had apparently anticipated. That was the gap. That was where we got in front of it. I completed a full neuropsychological evaluation with a specialist Inez recommended. My results were in the clinical language of the report, within normal limits across all assessed domains. Memory, executive function, processing speed, verbal reasoning. The doctor told me with a slightly amused expression that I scored in the 82nd percentile for my age group on the working memory assessment. You're fine, he said simply. I know, I said. But thank you. The independent review of the February appointment notes raised significant questions about their accuracy. Inez's colleague, the litigation attorney, sent a letter to the clinic. A letter was sent to my daughter-in-law's cousin's firm. And then Inez called me on a Thursday morning and told me the petition had been quietly withdrawn. I sat with that for a moment. Withdrawn, voluntarily, as of yesterday, because they knew it wasn't going to work, because they knew that proceeding would expose them to significant legal and professional liability. Yes. I asked what happened next. She said that was partly up to me. I could pursue a civil claim for abuse of process and attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. There was a reasonable case to be made. It would take time and money, and it would involve deposing my son and his wife under oath. Or I could do nothing, legally. Let them withdraw and let the consequences of their own choices settle around them without me pushing. I thought about it. I want to make one phone call first, I said. I called my son that evening. I told him I needed to talk to him, in person, and that it was important. He said he could drive down that weekend. His voice was careful in a way I recognized. The voice of someone who is waiting to find out what is known. He came on a Saturday, alone. His wife stayed in Chicago, which I took as information. He sat at the kitchen table. I made coffee. I put the clementines in the bowl because I always put them in the bowl now. I sat across from him, and I looked at my son, who has his mother's eyes and my father's hands, and I told him what I knew. All of it. The recording. The doctor, the petition, the withdrawal. He didn't deny any of it. What he did was cry. And I want to be honest about this, because it would be easier to say his tears didn't affect me, that I had passed beyond the reach of them. But he's my son. His tears affect me. They always have. He said he'd told himself it was for my own good, that he'd been worried about me, genuinely worried early on, before it had become something else. He said his wife had brought the conservatorship idea to him as a protective measure, and he'd believed her, and then it had moved faster than he expected, and he hadn't known how to stop it, and he'd told himself it wasn't really happening. That's not an explanation, I said. It's a description. He nodded. He knew the difference. Your mother, I said, and then I stopped, because I didn't know how to finish that sentence in a way that wasn't either too much or too little. I sat there for a moment. Your mother trusted you. He put his face in his hands. We sat there for a long time. The house was quiet. Outside, I could hear Russell's dog barking at something in the yard next door. I told my son that I wasn't ready to know what happened to his marriage. That was his to figure out. I told him I was not willing to be a person who could be managed or maneuvered, not by anyone, not ever, and that if he needed time to understand why I felt that way, I would give him that time. I told him I loved him. I told him I was angry. I told him both of those things were true at the same time, and I was old enough now to hold contradictions without needing to resolve them. He drove back to Chicago that afternoon. I don't know what he said to his wife. I don't know what she said to him. Inez sent a brief letter on my behalf to both of them, outlining what had transpired and what I was prepared to pursue legally if anything of this nature were ever attempted again. It was short and precise and unambiguous. I have not spoken to my daughter-in-law since. My son called me 2 weeks later. We talked for 40 minutes about mostly ordinary things. A project at his job, a restaurant he'd been to, the Cardinals. And at the end of the call, he said he was sorry, and I said I knew, and we hung up. It's not resolved. I don't know if it will be. But he called. That's something. Russell came over for dinner the following month. I made the pot roast Lorraine used to make, with the small adjustment she'd started making about 10 years ago, that I'd always thought was an improvement, even though she'd never been sure. I'd found her handwritten recipe card in the drawer beside the stove, the one where she'd crossed out one measurement and written a new one above it, and I'd followed it exactly. We ate at the kitchen table, the one with the uneven leg. Russell didn't mention the leg, and neither did I. After dinner, I told him what had happened, all of it. He listened without interrupting, which is a skill not everyone has. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. I wasn't sure, he said. When I handed you the phone, I wasn't sure if it was going to make things worse. It didn't, I said. He nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee cup and looked at it for a moment in the way people do when they're about to say something careful. Bev thought I was overstepping, he said. Bev is his wife. She said it wasn't our business. What did you say? I said she was probably right, he said. And then I showed you the recording anyway. I laughed. The first real laugh I'd had in I didn't know how long. It surprised me, that feeling, the way it moved up through my chest and out of my body, and for a second the kitchen felt almost full again. Tell Bev she was wrong, I said. He smiled. She knows. It's been 4 months now. I still drive out to the cemetery sometimes, but not as often as I did in the winter. Some mornings I sit in the backyard with my coffee and watch the neighborhood wake up. I reorganized the garage last week, which Lorraine had been asking me to do for about 6 years, and I found a box of her things from her office. Little desk items. A clay pot one of the grandkids had made. A photograph of the two of us from sometime in the early 90s when we were both squinting into the sun on a beach somewhere I can't quite remember. I put the photograph on the windowsill in the kitchen where I can see it from the table. I am 64 years old. My mind is sharp. My accounts are in order. My attorney has my complete medical documentation on file, and my son has my phone number, and my neighbor knows where I keep the spare key. The woman I loved for 38 years is gone, and that is a weight I carry every day, and I expect I will carry it for the rest of my life. But I have learned something in these months that I didn't know before, or maybe knew and had forgotten. Grief is not the same as weakness. Sadness is not the same as incompetence.